Trump has just released an executive order entitled Protecting Second Amendment Rights. This is unquestionably good news for gun owners, but the real question is, how good? The response has been just about what we would expect from the pro-gun and anti-gun factions, with the pro-gun folks being perhaps a bit too exuberant, and the anti-gun crowd screwing up their sour-faced Karen expressions in frustration. The order itself is very dry, bureaucrat, boilerplate government speak without specific details on what gun owners can expect to change in coming months. That's okay, because all of you have me to help you set realistic expectations, both positive and negative. I am, of course, attorney Andrew Branca for Law of Self-Defense. Hey folks, I want to take just a moment to invite you all to our upcoming live and 100% free Law of Self-Defense Hard to Convict webinar. This free webinar teaches you how to be hard to convict if you're ever compelled to use force in defense of yourself, your family, or your property. The webinar is live streamed by me personally, and there's plenty of opportunity for Q&A. Best of all, it's 100% free, but we do limit seats to allow for adequate Q&A. So I urge you to grab your seat right now by signing up at lawofselfdefense.com/hard-to-convict. Members of the Second Amendment community have received Trump's executive order on the Second Amendment with a degree of understandable exuberance. Often we in the gun community feel starved for Second Amendment favorable news, and this executive order is certainly that. But the enthusiasm may also be unrealistic. This YouTube channel, for example, Legally Armed America, ran with the headline, Trump issues executive order restoring the Second Amendment at all levels of government. Now, nobody would be happier than me if that were true, but I'm afraid it's not, because it simply can't be. Trump, even as president, lacks the constitutional authority to do that. By the way, I'm not picking on Legally Armed America in particular. He produces great content. Go check out his channel. Meanwhile, over on X, I'm seeing a lot of posts along these lines. President Trump issues an executive order ensuring no infringement on Americans' rights to protect themselves and their freedoms. Again, nobody would be happier than me if this were true, but it's not. It can't be. Meanwhile, of course, the gun control organizations are aghast that there might be even a slight decrease in infringement on the Second Amendment. Writing on X, here's Everytown for Gun Safety, quote, "He wants open carry, no background checks, no insurance, no instructions. That isn't what the Second Amendment was for." Well, I'm pretty sure all of this is exactly what the Second Amendment is for, not to have any of that. As an aside, I wonder how Everytown is going to be doing moving forward. Now that USAID has been shut down, is Everytown going to start bouncing checks now that its secret CIA funding is going away? Let's hope so. I must say that I did come across one YouTube video on this executive order that really did a pretty good job diving into the micro details of the order. I'll provide a link to that in the description for those who are interested. It's a good channel, does a lot of great gun content. My mission here, however, is to take more of a macro view on what we can expect from Trump's Second Amendment executive order and why. In a nutshell, the order instructs the Department of Justice to take the next 30 days to review all gun-related orders, regulations, policies, and so forth within the executive branch and identify any that improperly infringe on the Second Amendment, and then to present a plan to correct any such infringements. Then the plan will be reviewed with Trump's domestic policy advisor. Really, that's Trump's own review of the DOJ plan and any modifications he might want to make, and then the final version of that plan will be implemented. If our goal is to have reasonable expectations about the scope of Trump's executive order and the resulting plan, then we need to understand that gun law, gun control law, has 3 different legal silos. And importantly, Trump's authority only reaches one of those. The legal silo of greatest authority is, of course, the Second Amendment, which reads, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." As well as, of course, Supreme Court jurisprudence, further defining the Second Amendment, particularly the most recent Bruen decision. In Bruen, the Supreme Court held that Americans have a presumptive right to keep and bear arms for lawful purposes, particularly self-defense, and that the burden is on the government to prove gun control laws don't unconstitutionally infringe that right. In order to prove this, the government must show some tradition or historically comparable gun control law from the period in which the Second Amendment was ratified, meaning 1791. In other words, if the founders accepted a restriction, then it's okay. Otherwise, the law being proposed is an unconstitutional infringement. The problem for gun controllers, of course, is there existed virtually no gun control laws from that period. Certainly no permitting requirements, no laws on how guns must be stored, no laws on how long a rifle barrel can be, or how many rounds a firearm can be loaded with. So by the standard of Bruen, virtually every modern era gun control law is unconstitutional. That brings us to the second legal silo of gun control laws, statutes passed by Congress. I'm talking here about the National Firearms Act of 1934, the Gun Control Act of 1968, the Firearms Owners Protection Act of 1986, the Brady Act when that was in effect, and so forth. Now, in a just world, all those gun control statutes would already have been found unconstitutional and void under Bruen, but we're just not there yet. So those gun control statutes remain on the books and enforced, even as they are being challenged and gradually whittled down by Second Amendment advocates. But it must be said, with far too little assistance from the same Supreme Court that wrote Bruen only a couple of years ago. And finally, we have the third legal silo of gun control laws. These are executive branch procedures, practices, regulations, and rulings, which are really just bureaucratic opinions, and often whimsical and poorly reasoned opinions at that. So now we're at the good news, bad news part of understanding Trump's Second Amendment executive order. Let's do the bad news first. The bad news is that Trump's executive order has no impact on the first two legal silos of gun control laws, meaning Supreme Court jurisprudence and gun control statutes like the NFA and GCA. It means that Trump's executive order cannot, for example, remove the tax stamp requirement for machine guns or suppressors. It means that Trump's executive order cannot eliminate the requirement that a gun be purchased from your state's federal firearms licensee. We're not going back to the days of just being able to buy a shotgun with no paperwork at the local hardware store, like I have personally done in younger years. It means that Trump's executive order cannot do away with the requirement that even when a machine gun can be lawfully purchased, it must have been manufactured before 1986, now almost 40 years ago. That's a hard limit on what our reasonable expectations can be for Trump's Second Amendment executive order. It touches not a hair on any of that. But there's also good news. Trump's executive order can run roughshod over the third legal silo of government procedures, practices, regulations, and agency opinions. And that is huge because that third silo is wielded on a massive scale by gun control advocates and Second Amendment hostile governmental actors to harass, prosecute, imprison, and sometimes even kill our brothers and sisters in the gun community. Let me give a few examples. Within the second silo, the gun statutes that say you need special paperwork and a tax stamp to possess a machine gun or a suppressor or a short-barreled rifle. And if you don't have that, it's a 10-year felony sentence and a $250,000 fine. Okay, I'd call that an unconstitutional infringement of the Second Amendment. But however I feel about it, I can avoid tripping over that unconstitutional law simply by not possessing a machine gun or a suppressor or a short-barreled rifle, right? Well, I'm afraid not. As old Bill Clinton might say, it all depends on what the meaning of machine gun is. Clearly, a fully assembled and operable firearm designed to fire and capable of firing more than one bullet with a single press of a trigger would constitute what any reasonable person would call a machine gun. But what if there's a single part within that firearm that makes this capability possible? Let's call that part an auto sear. And without that part, only a single round fires with each press of the trigger. Now you no longer have a machine gun. But I'm afraid you do. Because even if the firearm itself is no longer technically a machine gun, that auto sear you're holding in your hand that you just took out of that weapon, that single inert metal part, the ATF calls that a machine gun Possession of that inert metal part without the required paperwork and tax stamp is good for 10 years in prison. Much the same is true for a suppressor. Certainly, a fully assembled and operable suppressor that reduces the audio signature of a fired shot would fall within the scope of the NFA, as unconstitutional as the NFA is. Well, some suppressors work by having rubber washers in them as replaceable parts. Guess what? If you possess one of those rubber washers, even without the other components necessary to assemble a functional suppressor, the ATF says you are in possession of a suppressor. Again, good for 10 years if you don't have the paperwork and tax stamp. Again, the same with short-barreled rifles. It's possible to have a firearm that visually resembles a short-barrel rifle but technically qualifies as a pistol. The pistol needs no special paperwork and no tax stamp. But then if you add a small vertical brace onto the underside of the barrel, your legal pistol has suddenly become an illegal short-barreled rifle, again good for 10 years in prison. And you can add in your own examples for arm braces, for 80% firearms, for destructive devices, all of that. All of these examples are serious felony crimes, not based on any constitutional law, not on any Supreme Court jurisprudence, not really on any gun control statute. They're based entirely on these very broad definitions promulgated by the ATF. And the ATF is entirely within the purview of Trump's authority as president, as head of the Article II executive branch of the government, and therefore of his executive orders. So one reasonable expectation for this latest executive order Trump signed is that all those definitions could just change, making those serious felonies just go away. Possession of an autosear or a suppressor baffle or an installed vertical grip on an otherwise lawful pistol would no longer be defined as felonies. The same for arm braces, 80% firearms, and so forth. To generalize this, where the ATF has discretion, it will be ordered to apply that discretion in a manner favorable to the firearms owner, rather than to prosecution, as has been the case for essentially all of the ATF's existence. This discretion would also apply to the Department of Justice generally, where we will reduce or stop defending gun control laws in court on the one hand, and will stop contesting appellate court rulings favorable to the Second Amendment on the other. In other words, going forward, the DOJ will spend little or no time constraining our Second Amendment rights in the courtroom. Importantly, this executive order change also applies to the ATF policies, not just definitions, but their actual procedures. For example, in years past, it was standing practice that if the ATF was reviewing the books of a federal firearms licensee and they found a clerical error consistent with simple human imperfection, say 2 numbers and an address were transposed, the ATF might provide some counseling to encourage that FFL to be more careful in the future. Under the Biden administration, however, the procedure is different. Even the slightest of clerical errors was used to completely strip that FFL of his license, putting him out of business. In some cases, the ATF would swamp every FFL in a large region, putting substantial numbers of them out of business, effectively creating a gun store desert and making it wildly inconvenient for local law-abiding citizens to exercise their Second Amendment rights. This is analogous to some government agency going around closing churches in a community because of clerical errors, effectively making it unlawful for the people in that community to worship. Even worse has been the ATF practice of operating as a paramilitary organization, complete with heavy armored vehicles and more. Once any agency is given this type of military-like resource, they inevitably use it, however unnecessarily, and with completely avoidable tragic results. Last March, for example, the ATF decided that the manager of a regional airport in Arkansas had violated one of their gun laws, and they went out to make his arrest. Let's pretend the arrest was appropriate for purposes of this discussion. Did the ATF send a couple of agents out to the airport where the manager worked within the secure area, and necessarily he'd be unarmed, and simply cuff him up, make the arrest? No. The ATF sent a heavily armed squad of agents to his home in the dark hours of the night. And as part of their operation, they cut off the power to his house. The airport manager, having no reason to believe he was the target of an ATF operation, woke up to unidentified armed men outside his home. The manager armed himself in defense of his home and family, as anybody would, and was soon in a gunfight with the unknown armed men outside. He was shot dead by the agents. Given the ATF's gun-heavy nighttime raid of this manager's home, surely he must have been suspected of some horrific criminal acts of violence, right? Nope. At worst, they believed he might have sold firearms without having first obtained the required paperwork from the ATF. This manager had never been known to commit or threaten a violent act in his life. A paperwork violation is why the ATF sent a squad of armed agents to this man's house in the dead of night, ultimately killing him. There is absolutely no reason why this man, Brian Malinowski, had to be killed, why his arrest had to be executed in this wildly aggressive manner. That was entirely within the discretion of the ATF and therefore falls squarely within the executive order authority of the president. How about a new rule for the ATF? How about any time they are contemplating making an arrest, and this is a process for which a formal plan is always prepared ahead of time, that they're legally obliged to use a method of arrest that is least likely to endanger human life, either the life of the agents or the life of the suspect being arrested. After all, that suspect is still presumed innocent of having committed any crime at the time of arrest. Naturally, if the ATF has evidence that an arrest target is likely to be exceptionally dangerous, they can take exceptional steps to ensure safety. And maybe then a heavily armed nighttime raid would be appropriate. But the burden would be on the ATF to prove it was necessary and not simply default to the most heavy-handed arrest process available simply because they've been equipped at a paramilitary level. There are other pro-Second Amendment initiatives the president can also pursue, some of which he has already pursued, through his executive authority. For example, Trump has already eliminated the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention. This office was effectively operating as a mini USAID money laundering operation, providing millions of dollars in grants to anti-civil rights organizations to facilitate their efforts to strip law-abiding American citizens of their Second Amendment rights. Now, that anti-Second Amendment office and that anti-Second Amendment funding has ended. Another thing Trump can do that may be of interest to some is when we are interested in NFA weapons, like a machine gun, like a suppressor, like a short-barreled rifle. In past years, when we've applied for that tax stamp and the permission to purchase that item, the delays from the ATF has sometimes been a year or longer. There's no reason approval for such items shouldn't be as quick as the background check on a 4473 buying a gun in your local gun shop, meaning maybe 10 or 15 minutes. So that would be an excellent change that Trump could make. All right, so all that's the good news. Trump can't eliminate Second Amendment infringement at all levels of government, as we might hope. He lacks that authority. But he does have tremendous authority to improve the Second Amendment environment through his executive powers, as we've just described. This is also, by the way, why Trump's choice for the new director of the ATF is going to be so critical. We cannot expect that President Trump himself is going to micromanage the bureaucrats and agents of the ATF. That's why there's a director position at the top of the agency. What we need in that director position is someone who will consistently apply favorable Second Amendment principles to the ATF so that the default orders and policy decisions are consistent with the Second Amendment. This means a principled Second Amendment advocate, someone like Brandon Herrera, for example, widely known as the AK guy on YouTube and every other social media platform. Certainly, Brandon has my full support for the position of director of the ATF. But if it's not to be Brandon, it needs to be someone of the same Second Amendment quality. What we don't need is just another generic career law enforcement officer who spent their entire professional life swimming in the anti-Second Amendment bureaucracy waters that up to now has been the ATF. Someone who's been surrounded for their whole career by orders, policy decisions, and a culture that fostered limits and constraints on our Second Amendment liberties. Let's hope Trump, presumably in cooperation with Pam Bondi, makes a good choice. Certainly their first choice, announced and then quickly withdrawn some weeks ago, was not a wise one. I'm hoping they heard the outrage of the gun community loud and clear and will make a better choice in a nomination the next time around. Finally, one big caveat to all of this. He who lives by the executive order sword can also die by the executive order sword. The next president can, of course, simply wipe away all of Trump's Second Amendment executive orders and policies with a simple snap of their fingers. Fair warning, it pays to ensure we continue to elect pro-Second Amendment presidents. I'll close out by reminding all of you that if you carry a gun so you're hard to kill, that's why I carry a gun so I'm hard to kill, so my family is hard to kill, then you also owe it to yourself and your family to know the law so you're hard to convict as well. Until next time, I remain attorney Andrew Branca at lawofselfdefense.com. Stay safe.